Okay, so let me go through and delete these objects. And, notice if I call the Hypershade back up again, Window, Rendering Editors, Hypershade, that the materials that we created for those objects, even though we deleted the objects, they're still there in the Hypershade for us to use. And so your Hypershade materials are saved with your scene. So the other thing you can do with materials after you've made them is you can edit them. And you can do that a couple different ways. One of the ways to do that, let me resize my Hypershade here, is if you select the material in the Hypershade, it will show up over here in the attribute editor. You can go and change the color here if you want. Or, if you don't have the Hypershade open, you can go here, right-click on it, and say Material Attributes, and that will also call it up over here in the attribute editor. And you can go back and do what you're going to do to that. So, what we're going to do next is we're going to actually go back in and edit this material, my first material, and we're going to be using our first texture map. And I tend to be sloppy with my terminology, so I will use the word material and texture interchangeably, because I'm that way. But really, they're two separate things, and the way to think about it is that the material is the big overarching term for any instruction as to how a surface is rendered. It has to do with the material. And a texture is just one subset of a material. So a material can use a texture, or textures are always contained within materials, is another way to think about it. So material can use a texture. This material that we created here so far does not have a texture to it. It just has a color attribute, and we can have these other attributes here, but they don't necessarily have to use textures. But what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and go into Photoshop and create our first texture. So open up Photoshop, File, New, and just go ahead and create, let's say, a 1000 by 1000 pixel image. Resolution doesn't matter. Set the color mode to RGB, background contents to transparent, and say OK. Alright, so we've got this here, and I'm just going to make a big dot. I'm going to get the brush tool and make it a little bigger. Kind of celebrate my Japanese heritage here, do that. Maybe put a solid color layer beneath it. White. Drag that to the bottom of the stack. Okay, so I've got a texture here. I'm going to save this as redsun.psd and hit save. Okay. So I've made my first texture. It's a square because remember we said that all textures will be made on squares, and since our plane is a square, we're in good shape. So I'll jump back over to Maya, and we're going to assign that texture to our material, and we're going to assign it to the color channel attribute here. So my first material, go here to the color attribute, and now click on this little checkerboard here, and this is going to call up the render node. Remember that everything's an interconnected bit of nodes here, so and we're going to choose a file. So we chose a file, and it says here file 1. But we're going to actually, we did is we created a node, we created basically a container to hold the file, but we haven't selected which file we want. So we're going to go down here to this little folder, down here where it says image name. Click on the folder to select a file. Mine's on the desktop. Redsun. Open. That should update. Here's the path. Here's a picture of the texture sample. Here's the updated version of our geometry. with the surface on it. And you can see this node up here is called File 1. And we could go ahead and rename that node to the, my first material image. Something like that. And there we go. So we've created our first material with a texture map.